Before I introduce you to our guests, I would like to introduce you to a new section of our journal, the Australian New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy. And this section of our journal is titled Conversations and Dialogues. As a practitioner living in different cultures and contexts, and I strongly value narratives, conversations, dialogues, oral histories, and stories. As we know, through telling and sharing of lived experiences, located in a time, place, context, and culture, we're able to come together, increase our understanding of each other, and therefore increase connection. My two guests are connected to the Mental Research Institute, which we will be exploring through the course of our conversation. I came across the following statement: the vision, I'm not sure whether it's the vision, but I'm assuming it's the vision of MRI as I look in the website. Stronger together, it says. No man is an island. No woman exists independent of her family, culture, friends, and living conditions. No child is free from emotional influence. No problem can be solved in isolation. And we can understand that as family therapists, of course. So I'd like to introduce each of my guests. So we've got Wendel, PhD. He's a clinical social worker, a licensed psychotherapist, and marriage and family therapist and supervisor. And he holds a PhD in marriage and family therapy and systems theory. Now, I do hope I'm doing the right bio here. If there's anything no longer, applicable, please do let me know, because we haven't rehearsed this. These are raw narratives, raw dialogues. So he holds a PhD in marriage and family therapy and systems theory, and he's a professor of education and professor of family systems theory in the marriage and family therapy program at the University of Louisiana. He's a former director of the Mental Research Institute, as well as a former member of the MRI Brief Therapy Center and the MRI Strategic Family Therapy Project. He's also director of the Don D. Jackson Archive and continues to serve as an MRI Senior Research Fellow. He has authored over 100 journal articles and book chapters, as well as 10 books translated in 8 languages. Wendel is frequently invited to lead seminars on systems theory and brief therapy across North and Central America, Europe, and Asia. His area of interest is in systems theory and the application of communication theory to understanding human behavior and interaction in promoting constructive change. So in addition to teaching, he maintains a private practice as well. Then we've got Dr. John Miller, PhD. John holds a master's in couples and family therapy and a PhD in child and family development, specializing in family therapy. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist and an approved supervisor. He has been in clinical practice for the past 25 years, having worked in China for the past 10. Hopefully I'm stating the right amount. John is a professor of therapy in the US and China. His approach considers the context in which problems occur and the relationships between people involved. He embraces a wellness approach and encourages clients to explore existing strengths and resources. He's a former U.S. Fulbright Senior Research Scholar to China from 2009 to 2010, and former Research Associate of the Mental Research Institute, former President of the Oregon Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. He has served on the Board of Directors of the American Association of Family Therapy, and he's director of the Sino-American, am I pronouncing it right? I do hope so, Family Therapy Institute. John has presented in many conferences when they are around the world. All right, so obviously, I mean, as we know, we were having a little chat beforehand, and I'm hoping I'm recording, by the way. I'm not really sure how to check that, but I do hope it is recording. I've met you both, of course, at different international conferences, including IFTA conferences, and the last one being in Aberdeen. We're just talking about that in Scotland in 2019, and that was just before COVID, the pandemic, what changed the world, the big thing. And certainly for me, that was my last one, international one. I don't know about you, but that was the last one for me. And I have only attended hybrid and virtual conferences since then. So yes, so that'll be quite interesting attending the next one in September. So Now, I would like to start our conversations by asking you if you could tell me about your individual involvement in the Mental Research Institute and the birth of your collaboration. All right, so whoever wants to start first.
We'll take it away.
And I'll be as brief as I'm not very brief, but I'll do my best to be brief. I started by reading papers that were published by members of the MRI, and I was fortunate enough in my studies to really get steeped in general system theory. I'm trying to think. Gregory Bateson's work fascinated me, as anyone who delves into it would say, I would say. And so it started with reading, and that led to pursuing training with different people in the world. And that at that time, and it's less so perhaps today, but at that time, it was pretty clear that the Mental Research Institute was the wellspring of so much, with all deference to the East Coast of the United States, Nathan Ackerman and other people, Carl Whitaker, so let us say, in the middle of the country. MRI had Gregory Bateson, it had Don Jackson, Virginia Satir, John Weekland, the MRI Brief Therapy Center, or group rather, Paul Vatsalik, Dick Fish. And once I began training there, I became addicted, basically. I kept going back for more training and more training. This is from about, golly, I don't want to mess this up.
That's okay.
Let's call it from the 1970s or late 70s. And the ideas are just so useful. And I was really delighted to hear when you were describing John Miller, that his emphasis on context, the nature of relationships. Well, much of that kind of way of thinking is rooted in the work of the early and even now researchers at the MRI. So I could probably say more, but that's probably enough.
Right, beautiful. Thank you, Wendel. John?
Yeah, well, I agree with all of that Wendel was talking about there. And really, I consider myself, I got into this because I was Wendel's student, actually, a long time ago, 30 years ago. And there is a story to it. I'm not even sure you know this story, Wendel, but I was at his university, and I had been a social worker. And Wendel was originally a social worker, and it still is. And I had worked for an orphanage in Louisiana, and I had a psychology background, tried to use an individual psychology lens to help the kids that I was working with there in Louisiana, and found it very frustrating. So I returned to school to get a master's degree, and it was again an individual psychology approach. And I actually wandered into one of Wendel's lectures. I don't know if you remember this, Wendel. I mean, you didn't know me at the time. And where my psychology sort of understanding, I feel, really let me down in a way, and not that, did the best it could, but it didn't help me make sense of things. Wendel's discussion was about these ideas, actually, the MRI ideas. And I changed my major immediately. Wow. To the chagrin of the psychology department, I immediately moved over to that degree, and have known Wendel ever since. That was 30 years ago. Wow. And indeed, that did prove out to be true. I learned a lot from that program back then that still I apply even now in China. It's very useful ideas.
Beautiful. What was exclusively something that changed your mind? So you are saying kind of the movement between the individual way of working and systemic thinking. So what was it about Wendel, particularly his personality? And what was it about him, his form of teaching? Or what was it that he was sharing with you as students that led you to become enamored with that notion?
Well, there's so many things to say, and you've seen Wendel present before, so it's never boring. Yeah. That was one thing, of course, but the other is it made complete sense about the things I had seen working with the kids, and then throughout the rest of my career, about how to make sense out of people's behaviors. And if you your original quote from the MRI, "No person is an island," I think that's a line Jackson, the Wendell put that article in my hand. It's the beginning of one of his articles where he made that point that these things are interconnected. And you take a kid, what they did in that time and age was a kid would misbehave in a certain way. They would take him out of his family. They would take him out of his community. They'd ship him off to a group home somewhere. And I would work with these kids for a non-trivial amount of time, and sometimes a couple of years, and they would pretty quickly just become little kids and get better. And then they would, some point we would say, "You're released," and you go back home. And this tragic thing would happen over and over again. And where a week or 2 weeks would go by, and whatever it was that got them in there would get them in there again. And it was almost as if that whole 2 years, I wasn't sure what we had done until I met Wendell. And then he put all these things in my hand. And now that made sense about how it was a problem like that would return. If you didn't address the system in which the child was in, it was sort of futile in a way. And so anyway, and there's many discussions we could have about that. Yeah.
Beautiful. Sounds wonderful to me. That's what a great birth to your relationship, the connection to the MRI Institute, and at the same time your collaboration and all that, which I'm going to move into recent times and the here and now, the present. Tell me about your current collaboration and partnership between the two of you, because I know you've done quite a bit. And in recent times, you've in fact collaborated in a paper late last year, I believe, I think somewhere September or something like that. 3 central concepts of teaching and learning with Paul Wolfson. So do you mind sharing a little bit about that? You can tell me about your collaboration and also perhaps mention a little bit about the 3 concepts.
How you want to approach this, John? You or me?
I'd rather you start on this.
All right. John, I seek John out. I hope I don't want to make him blush or anything. But if I get an opportunity, if we're at a conference or something, or if I learn that he's going to be at a conference, frankly, I'll make a point to go there. He's very bright and just has a natural way about him that is, how do I want to say this? I think conducive to healing. Let's put it that way. And so I'm a fan of John's, and I do think that there are certain ideas that I got. I'm sure there are many places one can pick things up. But just using as one example, the Milan team's positive connotation is an incredibly useful idea. And those kinds of, my thought is that, at least for me, one of the ways I retrained myself in life was to not only read these ideas from the earlier articulators of systems logic, but to embrace them to the point of trying to live them. And I failed to mention before, I was a cop. I was a policeman in the Air Force, and had the good fortune of getting in a serious accident and nearly dying, which completely changed the trajectory of my life, so that I had to learn something that I could do sitting in a chair. And that put me in an ideal position of becoming a counselor, basically. And then, thank God, I was surrounded by people who knew. I'm thinking of a particular person, Dr. William Saxon. John mentioned being a social worker. I am a social worker. In my MSW training, I don't know where I would be if I hadn't had Dr. Saxon as my teacher, my mentor. And he was and his wife, oh my, having such fond memories of John, not of John, of Bill and Ramona Saxon, actually, so nothing can take the place. If you get interested in throwing yourself into the literature and then trying to live what it is you're learning, as you don't blame others, look at the situation that people are having to deal with in their circumstance, figuring out how to talk to them in a way that they can understand what you're saying, which translates into speak the client's language. I mean, there's so many, there's such value to the early ideas, basically. And now I've lost my train of thought. I forgot what was your question?
That's okay. I was wondering about your collaboration, your partnership, how that arose. And you're giving me quite a bit of an insight about how that came to be.
Yeah, but so John was, once he left our program and went to Virginia Tech, but didn't you go to Virginia Tech University? Great reputation, great faculty. And then once he started, I think he went to the University of Oregon. He invited me to come here at least once, maybe more. It just led to a further deepening of our relationship. And fortunately, at least from my point of view, it led us to continue to this day to have serious conversations about clients, about how do you make sense of what's happening in a person's life. That led to the paper that we published fairly recently, focusing on just 3 fundamental ideas from, I said Paul Watzlawick, but really it's the Mental Research Institute group of avoiding negation, understanding what indicative and injunctive language is and using it, speaking the client's language. These are, and from my point, I just read that paper last night, thinking that was going to be what we discussed. And I'm not ashamed of that paper. It's not a bad paper. So I'm going to hush.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Wendel. John, do you want to add anything?
About our collaboration together, Wendel and I?
Yes.
Well,
how did it evolve to become what it is today, and hence what it led to your last collaboration with this paper?
Sure. Wendel and I started a conversation when I walked into that lecture hall 30 years ago that never really stopped. And we had just a wonderful time of it. It never seemed like work. Confucius says, find a job you love and you never work a day in your life. And that was always our work together. We did it because we wanted to all over the world these days. And so that never really stopped. And the ideas of Paul and the MRI, which Wendel just mentioned, were always laced through our conversations. And to me, like I mentioned before, seemed quite revolutionary compared to what I had learned before in the academy about how to treat certain problems. And I don't know if you get this, Wendel. Sometimes I'm asked the question, well, those ideas were, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Isn't that dated? And to me, no, not at all. And here in another continent, in country China now, and I find them equally as relevant every day to the practice across cultures in many ways, which I'm happy to talk about. But that's how it started for us, and trying to apply these ideas not only across the United States, but in different parts of the world. Wendel's also been here to China several times, and he and I also go to Cambodia, where we've done some work in Southeast Asia with the university there. And all those ideas from the MRI and Paul were relevant and could find application in those places. So it says something about their transferability.
That's wonderful. It's good to hear you both, the respect that you have for each other. And there's that sense of, it's not a hierarchy, when you go to start uni and as a, naive student, and then you go off into, there's a sense of, there's a sense, it seems to me, a congruency as well as what equality and congruency as well between the two of you, and your openness and your receptiveness, how you're receptive, but also you welcoming of each other and sharing of ideas. Some people tend to hold on to their ideas. Others want to share them, and the two of you are very much that. They would like to share those ideas, which is lovely, and it's so lovely hearing, because I didn't know the history behind it. I mean, history behind your connection at MRI. I mean, I know quite a bit about MRI, but I mean, how you came to be individually, how you found your place there, and how did your journey, how did that evolve, and your interaction with each other, your collaboration and your partnership. And also I very much like the notion of how you came, initially your beginnings, as a social worker, working with, orphanages and all that, and seeing the system and repeating the story, going back, sending it back into that environment, and the story keeps on repeating over and over. Yet through these teachings and these learnings that you realize, that kind of makes sense. And the manner in which Wendel conducted the teaching, that made it so real and was easy and, how can I say, digestible, if I can use that word. It's easy. Sometimes people just speak all these big words and all this in academia, and you lose people, you lose the students, and that's the reality. I myself have, most of my students are international, so they come from all over the world, particularly Africa. And, that's the kind of thing. So you can't lose them. You need to use, the interaction is what is important, so that's beautiful to see. And the police, your background as a policeman, and how you nearly lost your life. Wow, that's really profound. And how systems thinking was able to help you personally and professionally, I guess, isn't it? Wendel, that's very...
I don't advise it for others, but I spent 1 year of my life in the hospital.
Wow.
And you talk about a learning experience.
Yeah.
Where you're, that's a whole different conversation. But, having to learn how to walk and to talk and to, again, I mean, that's how cruel people can be, usually unintentionally. I've had some good opportunities to learn. And let me just say one more thing, since it's in my mind. Looking back, I don't want to repeat it. There is value to have everything taken away from you. So I'm told. I was not in any condition at the moment, but I had no brain activity for like 3 months. It's like a reset,
Wow.
And so it turned out, no matter what the situation, one can just learn if you're in it, and even if you fight it, you're learning.
Yeah.
You're learning the ups and downs, and pluses and minuses of arguing with things, right? So anyway, it's one of the best. Looking back at it, at the time, I thought my life had ended, and it had not even begun.
Yes.
And thank God for not being able to function for a while, and having to come back, from that anyway.
Yeah. Wow. How profound. Thank you for sharing that story. It seems to me, when listening to you about this situation, this time in your life when you thought you lost your life, you had to learn from the beginning to learn. It was almost as if you were born again. And then through that you realize the value about life and the important things that we take for granted, such as walking, and talking. And I guess in understanding and going on slowly and learning in a way, slowly, not rushing, because I'm sure through that year that you were in hospital, it would have come slowly, little by little. And kind of takes me back to the teaching. And perhaps that's what John was fascinated by you, because you were able to, you had almost lost your life. So in being reborn again, you were able to facilitate that learning. You sat from the perspective of the students. You weren't it wasn't like a sense of being spoiled in the level where you've lost touch with that. You started from basics. And how profound is that? And I think that's something that also attracted to John, and your students were able to really connect with that.
Definitely. Oh, yes.
Yeah, beautiful. Love that. Thank you so much. So let me see where to go from here. Okay, so many of those, of course, and we've talked about those that guided the current systematic practice, of course, originated from the MRI, as you both mentioned, Watzlawick, Jackson, Wickland, of course, Fish, Bateson, Satir, Minuchin, etc., to name a few, and of course, which you've mentioned. And I would like to know and you've mentioned some already, but was there any particularly, was there one or two? There tends to be one or two. I mean, we learn a whole pile of things. We really interact and we immerse ourselves in the learning. I'm wondering whether there were a couple of influences, one or two out of those that really, that you felt immersed in the learning, in the knowledge, and that really are able to feed and guide your practice professionally, personally, that had that influence. I wonder.
Wendell, why don't you start on that one, if you like?
Listening involves more than just your ears.
Mm-hmm.
And so waking up and paying attention with your eyes and with everything is important. Realizing that we are all of the same species, right? And actually, this is bigger than species as far as I'm concerned. There are differences culturally and they're important. And I'm not saying I agree with that. It's true. But we're of the same species, and we all have to define, we all live in relationships, and the kind of impasses or situations one might find oneself in differ, of course, but there are some similarities across, in my opinion anyway, across, and even say between cultures that are worthy of thinking about and paying attention to as you walk around on the face of the earth. And one of my serious influences, I wish I could call him my teacher, but he was dead before I ever even came in the field. Don Jackson is said that we all are doing the best we can all the time. And why would it be otherwise? When we'd rather be in pain, when we'd rather be in, not avoid pain than to be in pain. I'm paraphrasing now. Well, that really profoundly struck. It throws out the window this, from my frame of reference, unuseful idea that somehow we're different from each other. And then if one actually believes that, then you end up acting on it and then looking back and saying, what in the world did I just say? You know, how is it that I find myself involved in this manner? And I didn't even realize it until I actually participated in constructing whatever that dynamic is that's going on, that's unfortunate. So this idea that we're all part of it, it being the nature of interaction, that everything emerges out of that, and we actually can do something. You know, that makes me laugh. Even if it's not participate in the way that in the way that you feel like you're being positioned to interact, you can still, you have agency. You have some capacity to modulate or moderate anything, and you're part of it anyway, with no thinking about what are the consequences other than let's do no harm. Let's do our best to at least do no harm. Anyway, that's a good enough answer from me for the moment.
Beautiful. Thank you, John.
Sure. Well, many things I could respond to. I think you were asking about what are the influences from the MRI, anyone stands out in particular, you know, and thinking about that. Well, you know, Wendell opened all the doors for me there. And so I really began with Wendell, but to tell the truth, and we studied that stuff and he put those ideas in my hands, almost like it was like, and he had other students that I'm very close with as well. Jason Platt is one. When the three of us get together, we can stay up all night talking about these ideas. And so, you know, I don't really have one that I would just hold up. What I found about them was the way Wendell interacted with us, who were initially his students, was the same way I saw it when he introduced me to the people of the MRI that were still there about 15 years ago or so, 16 years ago or so. I could see that they had that kind of collaboration as well. And I remember the day I met Paul Vacevic. Wendell introduced me, of course, and we were working on a project there, and I had flown up to Palo Alto, down to Palo Alto from Oregon. And I walked up to Vacevic, which was very much like just a man on a pedestal to me. And so, and expected that hierarchy to be there. That was not at all what he was like. He was the most genteel man and so friendly. And the first thing he did, he walked up to me, and he was 80 then, something, 80 something. And he walked up to me and he had a paper in his hand and he said, "John Miller, I've heard so much about you from Wendell. And I just wrote a paper." And now he's 80 years old. He just wrote a paper and I've submitted it to a journal, and I would love it if you would read it and let me know what you think. And I thought, wow, there were so many lessons in him doing that he regarded me as a colleague immediately, and when he didn't have to in any way, and that he was writing a paper in his 80s, and for his own purposes. I went to his office. We talked for hours. It was not I expected the biggest office I had ever seen. It was a very small office full of paper, and a man that worked in his office every day, because I would imagine because he loved the ideas. Now Wendell's got a lot more stories about Vacevic, knew him very well, but that was my impression, Wendell, and you and I have talked about that since, and he was just kind from the very beginning. Perhaps in the spirit of this, one thing we wanted to write about him was this idea of avoiding negation as a way to go about helping people, And to just finish that, the way we ended up working together, and the reason we wrote this paper, is because we felt like, while there were many things said about Vacevic, we had this chance to teach with him actually when online classes were just really beginning to happen. This was about 16 years ago, and Vacevic, Paul couldn't fly at the time because of his health, but we could bring him into the classroom, which he really wanted to do, and he did it, I believe, for free. We tried to pay him at my own university. He didn't want to take it. He was just very interested in continuing to interact with students. And Wendell and I organized that with several universities across the United States. So we had several years of teaching this class with him to graduate students from across the United States. And these were three ideas that emerged again and again as he discussed therapy and the way he thought about therapy and how to help people. We thought they had been articulated in some places, but not fully in the way we wanted to. And Wendell was really the master of kind of condensing them into descriptions that we could use for the paper. And so we tried to put as many examples in that paper of him using those three central ideas as we could.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you. Which leads me to asking you, or just checking in terms of the founders, I guess, of systems theory, the clinicians, practitioners, they're predominantly from psychiatric backgrounds, right? Not all of them, of course, but the majority, a great deal of them. However, there are the exceptions, like we are talking about this. All of us, have a diverse, I did social work and psychology, and then did, family therapy and all that kind of thing. So initially I started with teaching. You started with as a policeman, you started with, what I mean? So it diverse, how can I say, contribution. So Haley, for example, had a master's of communication. That was his, communication. And I guess as I've been reading about it, I'm just as I immerse myself in kind of those ideas, I guess I thought the sense of communication, and perhaps that's the reason why also Bateson invited him. Perhaps it would have looked appealing to him to invite him to the research project, communication research project, because of his communication background. And I found that quite interesting, because later on, then Haley, of course, became very much involved in a lot of the stuff. They did a lot of writing together. So, and of course, so influential in the pivotal moment where family therapy was born, And so I guess that part of diversity to me is very important. The richer stories and the more you can collaborate with different thinkers and different ideas, different cultures, different contexts, I think you get a much more rich outcome in research, in teaching, in practice, anything, isn't it? So that diversity is extremely important, and being able to facilitate the collaborative process as well, being key, isn't it? So did you want to add anything about that, the communication research project, or even the mode of communication? Because I was going to go on into talking about communication, in fact, and the diverse form of communication. Did you want to say anything about that at all that comes to mind? You don't have to, but I wanted to move into the communication part of it exclusively. Given particular, I mean, we're talking about conversations and all that, and dialoguing, the richness of the stories and communication. You can't say something at the moment.
Earlier, John used the word that I love, and he said naivety.
Yeah, naivety. Mm-hmm.
I think that if one is interacting with someone that you had no experience with at all, ever, then it is absolutely useful to embrace your being naive. You don't know this person. You don't know the rules of the road, so to speak. So being naive is or engaging with others on the idea that you are in a new land and you don't know the way, whatever, as though there's only one, I think is a really helpful idea.
Absolutely.
This idea of being naive and embracing it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that.
Beautiful. John, is there anything you want to say at this stage?
Well, you mentioned about culture, and
yes.
I guess I mostly work in China these days.
Yes, and I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, and cultural differences, and that to me, the ideas that Wendel introduced me to, and that were articulated at the folks at the MRI, Jay Haley, you mentioned, and Paul Vasovic is the focus of our paper. It speaks to their utility in that they're equally as useful, I have found, in the Chinese context and Southeast Asian context, where also Wendel and I do some work and with perfect clarity and utility. And I remember there's a line from Pragmatics about Pragmatics of Human Communication was one of the major books that Vasovic helped author. We actually translated it into Chinese, and it's one of the central textbooks here for the practice of family therapy. So Vasovic's influence continues even to this day to this completely new environment in China. Anyway, it talked about that communication is where it's at in a way as you try to understand people, and that's the medium by which we express. It's the handle. You can get a handle on a thing, and other maybe things are esoteric in some way. And I find that I get around China, although my Chinese is terrible. Vasovic at one point said 80% of what we communicate is in the analogic or the nonverbal communication, and that's completely true. And Wendel and I, in our travels around the world, we have seen this in other cultures that we tend to get along fine, and after a while, I forget that I don't speak the language of whatever country we're in, because I think we took to heart the idea that people show you who they are, that you can figure out what's going on given the context, as Wendel was talking about before. That all behavior makes sense if you understand the context, especially when you go to other cultures, you have to hang on to that idea. Okay. Context is everything. And there's finally one other idea that I use all the time here in China, which is a line from Bateson, sort of like, it's a story. I think you have to understand the American idiom of this, the origins of the story, which is, two kids on a playground, one says you're stupid, and the other one says it takes one to know one. And Bateson had this famous comment, and he said, that's not exactly true. It actually takes two to know one. And he had some meaning about it, but that was multivariate. The meaning I took from it was that you don't really know the culture you're in. You don't really know it intimately until you leave it and immerse yourself in another and then return. As I've had, and Wendel's traveled around the world many times, and you can add to this, Wendel, as you like, but I feel we both talked about it, that the glory of traveling, you mentioned international issues and global issues in this, is that you learn how arbitrary some of the decisions you make or the ways of living that you have are. Here in China and Southeast Asia, and the decisions that other cultures that we've been to, you realize, and you go back home and you realize, oh, how arbitrary it is that we've decided to live life this way. It's another testament to the power of context, which is all about what the MRI was about for me.
Yeah, beautiful. And I was going to kind of name some of these too. I was going to ask you about China, but you came in, so that's great. You went ahead of time, so that's fantastic. Because I'm always curious. A lot of the work I do, I work extensively. I've lived within two cultures. You know, I'm born in South America, Peruvian, came to Australia 30-something years ago. I have not lost my accent, and I'm proud to not have lost my accent. I very proudly wear my accent with gusto, you know. So I feel very much, because there's traces of me, the Peruvian traces that live, you know, that are perceived, that are seen in Australia, and I think that's a good thing. And so a lot of my work revolves around. I've actually developed this model that is called My Culture, and in working extensively with people from different cultures. We call them, in Australia, we call cultural and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So, you know, so I work a lot with people from different cultures, cross-cultural couples. 70% of the couples that I see are, you know, cross-cultural. And my students, as I said, the majority are from international students, you know, from cold backgrounds, some refugees, previous refugees and all that. So this is quite a rich diversity of groups, you know. And of course, the fact that the important thing to me for communication. So to me, I feel that communication, you know, what I call it's communication is to our relationship what breath is to life, I feel. You know, it's the medium of interaction, and language is the medium of communication, and that kind of thing. So that's such an important aspect. And when working with particularly, of course, cultural couples, I find that quite interesting, because I normally talk about first order language, second order, the original. And sometimes when you communicate, I mean, you know, relationships in couples, I mean, there's going to be a sense of, you might be saying this thing, but what do you connect the most closely emotionally? You might be missing something. So to me, communication is key. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to interview you as well, that I have a conversation with you both, because of, you know, the historical context and your interests and your collaboration and interaction and all that. I find that extremely helpful. And of course, that's a key aspect of humanity and systems, and a central aspect of our work as systemic and family therapists, of course. We communicate with our clients, they communicate with us, they talk to us about their interactions and communication with their children, parents, spouses, etc., etc. We can make it or break it. It can connect us or disconnect us, or it can unite us or confuse us, like in the double bind. You know, it can really confuse us. So really, and I was going to ask you, you know, Joan, about that interaction, how, you know, in terms of working in China, how has that been, that transition in terms of culture? Because when people communicate, if the students are speaking English in your class, or they're speaking, you know, Mandarin or whatever they might be, I mean, you can tell us, and what is that? And they are learning, you're teaching them in English, and you know what I mean? So there's different aspects. And I know with my students, I need to kind of a little bit of what Wendel was talking about, starting to learn in different ways, you know, like when you have your accent, learning how to walk, learning how to communicate and all this, and learning how to teach is a bit like that, you know. And so that's what I find with my students. So yeah, my mode of teaching is different, right? So I'm just curious about what would you be doing over the last decade that you've been in China?
Sure. And Wendell has been here too and contributed.
Yes,
and,
that's right, Wendell.
To that, and he's come here to teach, and we're thankful for that. I would say one thing about China, and China's a unique area for the field of family therapy right now. Really, China did not have a tradition of mental health counseling as we think of it. There was no actually translatable word for therapy as we understand it up until about 16 years ago, when I first started coming, and not because of me necessarily. Virginia Satir had come in very early on and had a tremendous influence, as had Salvador Minuchin, you know, and I worked with Minuchin a bit before he passed away. And Sal told me, he said, well, John, he said the 20th century was the purview of family therapy in the Western world. But he said, without a doubt, the purview of family therapy in the 21st century is going to be in Asia, specifically China. And that was my experience when I came here 16 years ago.
Is this Sal? You said Sal told you that. Sal Minuchin.
Yeah. Sal told me that. And because he had come here and done quite a bit of work, and was very supportive of my coming here. He wanted to come. And his wife, Pat, said, oh, no, Sal, you could not. She forbid him, essentially, because the airline flight. But I would have brought him if he wanted to come, because he very much enjoyed it here in the same way I do, because there's this brand new chance. And Wendell, you can speak about this as well, because Wendell's come several times to help teach here. But when the Chinese culture had a chance to choose a mental health discipline of the many, many that are out there, social work, psychiatry, psychology, and so on, to them, one of my jobs was to come in and explain what were the various options to them. And they immediately said, well, of course, family. Why would you do it any other way? To them, it was quite puzzling that we actually had this dizzying array of other choices. To them, it seemed completely logical, because in the Chinese context, family is everything. Family is central, even over the individual many times. And community is important, context, as Wendell was talking about. And the other part of that is, in the Chinese context, the teacher is very important. I'm the teacher here, but Wendell's my teacher. And in the Chinese way, this is they call it filial piety, or a lineage sort of approach. It was very important for them to meet Wendell and understand him. And I guess I made sense to them once, for the context that I come from, once they met Wendell. And of course, they very much enjoyed his lectures here and so on. But that's what I would contribute. Wendell, I don't know what your thought about that is in your travels here. Wendell and I have both taught here and seen cases here with Chinese families.
Right.
We've done that here. So I don't know what you would contribute, Wendell.
Fantastic.
I am very content with your response to that, John. I certainly enjoy going to different cultures, and China is such an enormous, geographically, population-wise place that that one needs to have some sense of curiosity and being humble, because one is really putting yourself at a disadvantage if you think you know things that you don't know. And so I who knows if this COVID business gets under control.
Yeah.
In a blink of an eye, I'll if upon invitation, I'll come and pester John anytime.
Yeah. Something that you said too, sorry, Wendell.
No.
I was just going to go back to your naivety, and I quite appreciate that, because that's something I talk a lot about curiosity, being humble, being naive, about it, because we cannot know everything that there is to be known about culture of a family, the culture of, we cannot know. And if we assume that is the case, we're actually disadvantaging the person, the family, the group. And it happens a lot with Aboriginal people in Australia. We talk about cultural awareness training. We normally have, is usually in a lot of organizations, you're supposed to be conducting cultural awareness training. And I've written a few papers with other people, other disciplines as well, very different, non-therapeutic, but health professionals as well. So then, we talk about that in the point that the misconception that people think, they arrive to the conclusion of, okay, I've attended 2 days cultural awareness training, so I know everything. And we cannot know everything. Or even for me, like, I have lived in Australia longer than I have in South America, but I cannot know everything about Aboriginal people, even though I've attended many 2 days of cultural training. So the way I look at it certainly is naivety and the part of the knowing and not knowing kind of thing. So you know some things, but you cannot know everything. And usually the point I make is that it's an ongoing process. It has no expiry date. I often say that to my students. It has no expiry date. You continue to learn and process. You know what I mean? You never cease to learn. And that's really important, I guess, isn't it? So I quite appreciated the naivety and what you were saying there too, John, about the process, like both of you. And I would think that you may use different ways of communicating with this to practice or teaching and all that, whether you need to adjust some things, or, there would be some elements that might not be overt, but they may be covert nonetheless, Yeah. So now I'm sure, or rather I hope, that our conversation would be captured by other practitioners in our field, of course, throughout different parts of the world, different cultures. other institutions, association members, et cetera, et cetera. So what is the message you would like to give or send to other family therapists around the globe about your work with MRI, about those influences you've had? There might be some students watching this, and that kind of thing. What would you like to say?
John, let me just get this off. The reason why how do I want to say this? My students suffer from my love of the early, and it's not that early, it's the 1950s, so really, we're only talking 50 years ago. So they're new, really, in some great respect. But the ideas that are in those early papers are just profound and absolutely relevant to living and breathing on the face of the earth at this moment. So two ideas that are to me related that jumped up, and I wrote them down, is non-normative, non-pathological. The ideas from the early times in this group on the west coast of the United States, at least, really embrace this idea that who do you think you are to see what is common to your experience as normal? If you're in another situation, in another circumstance with other people, and it's different than whatever your limited experiences have been, then wow, we are paying for we as a species are paying for that arrogance, basically. To if it isn't what I think it is, then it's wrong somehow, or I have, it's incumbent upon me to not learn it and instead try to eradicate it. That's crazy. So anyway, there's some basic ideas articulated, and so my thought is, don't avoid the early literature.
Yeah.
Instead, read it. Think about it. One of the papers many say that I hang with, launched our discipline, is a paper called Toward a Theory of Schizophrenia by Bateson, Jackson, Weekland, and Haley. That paper I read every year, at least once a year. And I ask my students to read it, and then I act as though they have. Because it comes up in our interactions if I'm behind a one-way mirror watching therapy, as an example. And that's just one example of a body of literature that's dense with good ideas. Now, this is to say not to read current material, of course, or if you get an opportunity to write and contribute, do anyway. So the ideas of non-normative, non-pathology jumped in my head even to this moment as ideas that I don't know how I could conduct myself, not only as a counselor, but as a human being, without in some way, perhaps using different words, embracing those ideas. If you look for pathology, by golly, you're going to find it. And it's as much as how you're looking at it as anything else that you think you're seeing that's involved in that pathology. And so, pay attention and have some sense of there's consequences to how you conduct yourself in the situation, as much as whatever it is you think you're seeing in the behavior of others.
Thank you, Wendel. Thank you, Wendel. John?
Oh, I couldn't answer any better than that. I agree completely. Of course, I love these ideas. And as I said before, I think were really revolutionary ideas and still are, really. When you look around the world, I noticed some of the things you wrote to us about that we might talk about, the global condition and COVID and so on. And I think these ideas are applicable to really a global understanding of the world and the way people work and so on. Back to Jackson's comment that he got from Adam Smith or somebody else. I think he was quoting somebody else, but no one is an island. And I think that certainly you had asked about this with the virus and so on, which I'm under lockdown in Shanghai here, which is their method of dealing with it. But it's in this environment, all behavior makes sense in context. The context really matters, and you really can't island off somebody. Is I think what a virus will sort of teach you, is that you can't sort of lock out the world. The world finds its way, to interconnect essentially, and so the world is highly interconnected. And those were some of the ideas that the MRI people totally understood from systems theory and applied directly to the practice of therapy. Like I said initially about working with an individual child with a problem is kind of a very limited way of helping them, like I did in the orphanages, without understanding the context in which they're coming from and doing something about that. And that has application not just to family therapy, but to everything in a way. It has great utility to understanding things like economics, like the way viruses work, the way global economies work, and so on, things that really are everybody's paying attention to these days. So I guess that would be my contribution to that. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. And I guess indeed, given the global pandemic, all these changes, we had to reinvent ourselves, see the world in a different way, be in the world differently, interact differently, be isolated, be an island in a way, and how do we do it? So we need to be able to try and adjust and be able to kind of a bit, it takes me a little bit to what Wendel was saying, kind of learning, being reborn almost, like relearning how to accommodate, how to adjust to all these changes that are constantly coming from lots of angles, and highlighting the meaning of communication, how important interaction communication is for us. And something I say, is, of course, comes from Bates and ideas, of course, we're interconnected, interdependent beings. We need each other to survive and thrive, and in a lot of the, the global pandemic has stopped us from doing that, but we desperately need to connect. So we need to find different ways. Just doing this very thing today, I couldn't come to the States or to China to see you. So being able to do this, that's great. We are trying to adjust and adapt and try new ways to still maintain communication, which is great. Thank you so much. I'm really very appreciative to have you and for your openness and, your sharing of ideas. I'm really very, very grateful to you both. And I do hope that we'll be able to catch up. You need to come and teach something at, come and organize a seminar or something here in Western Australia. I think you were here not too long ago. Is that right, John? I think you were, or no, that was Melbourne, I think, wasn't it? For the breath therapy or something?
Melbourne, that's amazing. You know that. Yes, that's right before the pandemic happened. That was my last trip out. And it was lovely. And I would love to come visit.
Yes, you need to come to Western Australia, even further.
Excellent. No, I would welcome that chance.
Beautiful. So you both, I would love to have you here. All right. You take good care. Thank you so much to both of you. Keep well.
Thank you.
See you soon.